Monster Hunter has been around for 2 decades now, but I only got into the series when World released. So I decided to go back and experience the older titles and face every first monster from every single generation in order to see how far the series has come. From clunky PS2 era controls, locales that I've been missing out on, and monsters that I've never seen before, let's find out what I've been missing out on all these years. We start the hunt going all the way back to 2001 where the series was born. Capcom started developing the game during the 90s, and some of you may know that Capcom during this time was at its peak experimentation and innovation phase. They forged together a team to create a game that combined action, RPG elements, and cooperative multiplayer. Inspired by the idea of hunting giant monsters in a living ecosystem, they focused on strategic gameplay, resource gathering, and crafting. And like many first games in a series, this one is extremely basic, with a lot of the rough edges that the team would eventually smooth out over the years. That means coming back to this game today isn't the greatest experience. But you know, with the right kind of mindset, going back to play these older games is quite fun. My mindset might be crushed though, however, if I tried to fight something like Rathalos, because man, these controls are weird. It's worth noting that I played the Japanese version of the game, as it has online capabilities. I added an English patch as well as another patch that gives you quality of life features like 16:9 support and portable controls. And the portable controls here are a lifesaver because by default you use the right stick to control your weapons attack. And that is as frustrating as it sounds, so this just changes it to the face buttons instead, like the modern Monster Hunter games. The way I did this was just using a program like Delta Patcher to patch the original ISO file. Also, we are emulating this on the PCSX2 emulator with these settings if you'd like to copy. There's nothing special here as the game already looks great by default, it's just an internal resolution bump and anisotropic filtering set to 16 times. When I arrived in town, I was initially handed 1500 Zenny for doing nothing, which I spent on getting myself a weapon. I also had a bit left over after that to get myself a helmet and a chest piece. What I realised later on though is I just purchased a hunter's knife, which was the weapon that I already had, so I basically wasted my cash here. It was also weird that you start with a sword and shield, as I'm used to starting with an item box filled with every weapon that you want to choose from, so it was a bit weird that I was locked into using this weapon, but I thought it'd be cool to try it as I've actually never used it in the modern games. Unlike modern games where you have 1,000 blips telling you where to go, this game really just dumped you into the village and expected you to figure out yourself. And I did that by wandering cluelessly around town before finally finding the quest giver. My first quest wasn't all that exciting. All I had to do was find raw meat. This was a big change in pace to what I'm used to in the series. The latest entries are go 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 with tons of action, whereas here we're doing things slow and steady. I exited the camp and saw the landscape for the very first time. This game is gorgeous for its time, and what I love most about it is that the vision that the devs had of it being a believable, living ecosystem shows even here in their first attempt. You can see the wildlife going about their day in the background, you can collect stuff throughout the environment, and also the ambient sounds alone. They specifically do so much to bring the world to life. Now because I've played previous entries, I knew I had to kill these monsters in order to get raw meat, but what I wasn't expecting was the amount of blood that came out of them when I hit them. It made me feel really guilty compared to the other games. When he went down as well, he continued to struggle, which made me feel even worse. Feeling like a bad person, I headed back and completed my very first mission. And then I was tasked to go out and do the same thing, but this time cook the meat. It's cool to see that after 2 decades have passed, this still looks exactly the same today. And when I finally got a well done steak, I heard the most satisfying sound ever. Okay. I've been hearing about Monster Hunter fans get excited about the return of this sound in Wilds, and I can finally understand the hype. After finishing this quest, there were a few more tedious quests that I had to do, but there was this one super long-winded one which was to catch a sushi fish. I got the hang of actually catching the fish, but every fish that I caught weren't the fish that I needed. I decided it was probably best if I go to a different fishing spot, and so it led me to a cutscene, which is always a telltale sign that you're going in the right direction. There was an angry bull Fango in my way, but after taking some hits, he was pretty easy to overcome. These little accomplishments in the game are top notch. It might not seem like much, but the first fight with an aggressive monster was so impactful and meaningful compared to some of the stuff that's in World. It's not better or worse than World, it's just different. The hardware limitations of the time obviously kept them from doing amazingly epic set pieces, but often in an art form like gaming, having less to work with sometimes leads to more creative work. And here, the small things like this actually matter a lot, and every little thing that you do feels like an amazing accomplishment. Like finally catching this sushi fish. And with that quest out of the way, it was finally time to go on my first monster hunt. The Velocidrome wasn't exactly an impressive fight, but it was super fun to fight a pack of monsters. In World, for example, you never really fight multiple monsters like this. There's turf wars of course, but never fighting say 3 Great Jagresses at once. So this was a really nice change to what I'm used to. The actual design of the monster wasn't crazy. Its blue colour made him stand out amongst the other monsters that I saw so far, but it's just a regular looking raptor. I wasn't really expecting anything grand for the first monster of the first ever game in the series, but the hype that I felt playing this game meant that I didn't really care what he looked like anyway. I was just focused on getting that kill. And getting the kill, whilst not as hard as I thought it was going to be, wasn't easy either. Fighting a group like this can be frustrating. 3 monsters combined with the wonky camera controls made this whole situation a fight with the camera more than the actual monsters themselves. It was still a really fun fight though. The usual looping around the area and attacking meant that after a few hits, I had wiped out all 3. Excited to carve the first kill of the video, their bodies for some reason just disappeared and I didn't get the satisfaction of carving them. Reflecting back on the experience of the first game, would I play it again? Probably not. It's just too basic and old school for me to get proper sucked into it, but did I enjoy my time? 100%. This game is the start of an incredible series, and so much of what makes this series special to me is here, and for that, it was a super fun time. For the second generation, I initially was going to only play Monster Hunter 2, which was exclusively released in Japan, but I ended up going with Freedom Unite as well in order to get a feel for both. For starters, Monster Hunter 2 was a significant evolution for the series. Building on the foundation of the first, Capcom aimed to refine and expand the experience by making the ecosystem way more dynamic, as well as day-night cycles and seasonal changes that affect the monster's behaviour and resource availability. This was also the first game to introduce the Longsword and Hunting Horn, 2 legendary weapons in the series. There's the same English and enhanced patch for this game as well, so that you can use the face buttons instead of the right analog stick. My first thoughts was that the game looked a little bit better with a noticeable increase in the texture fidelity, but since we're still in the PS2 era of Monster Hunter, the increase in fidelity isn't major. I was also able to buy a full set of gear and a greatsword right off the rip this time, which was a blessing. And I also preferred the village in this one, both aesthetically and functionally. It's got a really cozy seaside vibe with a way easier layout to understand. My first quest was pretty simple like the first game, and it was to collect some mushrooms. I noticed the patch that I installed wasn't working for the game, but after I got it fixed, my widescreen patch disappeared. I found one online but it didn't do anything, so I just dropped it altogether and went full 4x3 nostalgic mode. What I noticed first in this game was similar to the previous one, how damn pretty the backdrops are. Again, the limitations of the console really did not stop the team from capturing that expansive feeling of the world. It is still an extremely beautiful game even today, and it has such a hard to explain vibe to it that's just really calming. Also, compared to the first game, there was very little setup. It felt like I collected some mushrooms, killed a Bullfango, and it was time. Time to face... Yeah, this was unfortunately just a copy-paste of the monster I had just faced previously. The fight definitely felt more refined than the first one and a little bit more difficult too. It still is just a Velocidrome fight however, so there's not much more to say here. There was however this time around just one Velocidrome to fight, and then some Velociprey to go alongside it. The little bugs and side monsters were actually the most annoying part of this fight, as I could not hit them for the life of me. It was also the first fight that I got to use the Greatsword. Unless I was doing something wrong in this game, it only had 2 attacks with no combos. You can't charge your first attack and then follow it up into a 3-hit combo like you can in the modern games, so here it's just simply a charge up, hit, and then reset. I also completely choked my first attempt at this monster and took my very first feint of the video. I quickly ran out of potions, so I came back the second time with more of them and finished the kill. And with the Velocidrome down a second time, let's head over to the other entry in the second generation. Monster Hunter Freedom Unite was released in 2008 for the PSP. It was a landmark entry in the series and a culmination of Capcom's effort to refine the portable Monster Hunter experience. Monster Hunter games are usually developed by 2 teams. Most people dub them the mainline series team and the portable team. So whilst this game is made by said portable team, it still has that same vision that the mainline series has. And as we've explored, that's the main theme of a living ecosystem. Besides that though, the dev team focused on the accessibility and replayability of this one, introducing the Feline Comrade system, which allowed AI controlled companions to assist the solo players. It also introduced G-Rank quests, which gave veteran players a new tier of difficulty. So since this is on PSP, I switched over to using the annoyingly named PPSSPP emulator, which I have not used in ages. Here are the settings that I used to play the game if you want to copy mine. At first glance, this game was straight up incredible given its age. I adore the snowy theme of this game, with the village being in full winter mode, and the music that accompanies it as well stood out as one of my favourite village themes thus far. I got my bearings with the place, and for the first time so far, had an item box in my room with all of the starting weapons and a set of starting gear. It did make me look like I had just cheated compared to the previous games where I wandered around in my shorts, but I'm not complaining. I then found Puggy wandering around the village, which was a nice familiar face to me having played World. This is a PSP game, by the way. My starting quests were hunting some Blangos, getting some mountain herbs, a Popo tongue, and killing Geoprey. And Geoprey are the smaller version of the first monster of this game. There is clearly a running theme with the starting monsters this early into the series, as this is basically just the Velocidrome, but icy. This guy was in my experience a little bit more difficult to take down, only because I was trying to fight him whilst the other monsters kept sneaking attacks in. It didn't help that I came into this fight extremely unprepared. After a feint or two, I learnt from my mistakes and took him down, which marked the end of the second generation of Monster Hunter games. Released in 2013 for the Wii U, Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate is an expanded version of Monster Hunter Tri, which was released in 2009. Its most substantial feature this time around was adding underwater combat. This allowed players to hunt monsters in fully aquatic environments for the very first time. It also introduced the Switch Axe. It also again became more accessible, which is a running theme throughout each title. The newer that they get, the more quality of life improvements that the team made over time. Tri specifically also emphasizes quality over quantity, with there being a smaller roster of monsters. This small amount meant they focused on giving them super unique behaviors and interactions. Monster Hunter 3 was a massive jump up in quite literally everything. Fidelity and gameplay were night and day differences to what I had played so far. I played this on the Wii U emulator Cemu, which means it runs at 4K 60fps, and it just makes everything look amazing. Besides looks, I started to see the series getting more simpler at this point. I was so quickly geared up and within literal minutes was in the world killing monsters. Not gonna lie though, this starting locale was not as jaw-dropping as Freedom Unite in my opinion, but the added fidelity that the Wii U could bring more than made up for it. The tutorial pop-ups in this game also were a nightmare. I get that they were trying to make the game more accessible, but pausing the game so abruptly to tell me the most basic stuff was super annoying. Unlike the previous games where I was accepting quests, this one was a bit more open-ended. I had to do a ton of stuff before I even unlocked quests. There was an interesting new mechanic, for example, where I had to kill monsters in order to gather resources in order to unlock things in the village. After collecting 30 of them, then I was allowed to take on quests. Like I said, there was a lot of hand-holding in this game compared to the previous ones, which made this first session really tedious, as up until this point, I have played so much Monster Hunter. After playing just under 2 hours of the game, I had a look at a quest list online and realised that I was still pretty far away from killing the first monster, so I did what any sane person would do in this situation, and I downloaded a save file. This was purely because I still had a few more Monster Hunter games to play through, and I didn't have the time to go through all of the quests I needed to in order to reach the first monster. I unequipped the super powerful gear and re-equipped the starting gear, told my feline companions to stay at the village, and then headed out to kill the very first monster that you face in Monster Hunter 3. This monster was by far my favourite thus far in the video. His design was cool, he yes was still a raptor, but he had unique details like whatever you call the giant flaps on his head, as well as fur running along its back. What I noticed earlier on in the fight was that his behaviour was way more believable than the monsters we have already fought. At one point he called his buddies for backup and in came a whole squad of Jaggies. He did certain things like leaving the area once I had killed all of these Jaggies, as well as drooling when he was weak, and also kept changing his fighting style throughout the whole battle. He wasn't all that difficult, but I did fail the mission once due to accidentally taking on the one where you have to capture him. The quest that I should have took instead to kill the Great Jaggi was in a sandy locale instead of the one that you start in. This biome was noticeably a lot brighter and vibrant to what I've been used to so far. The series does kinda shift from being quite dull to then being colourful, and this game is definitely on the colourful spectrum. After finally taking down the Great Jaggi for real this time, I noticed how much I enjoyed this game. Up until this point, Monster Hunter 3 was my favourite title by far. The village wasn't as nice as the Freedom Unites one, but besides that, the underwater combat really intrigued me, and out of all of these, this one is probably the one that I'm most likely to return to in the future. I wasn't sure if that opinion was going to stay for long though, because the next game gets quite a bit of praise from fans. Monster Hunter 4 was released in 2013 for the Nintendo 3DS. It marked a major evolution from the series due to the dev team essentially refreshing the franchise with new mechanics, a more dynamic world, and a stronger narrative focus. They honed in on enhancing the mobility, verticality, and also the overall player engagement. This is the first game of the video where I actually already have a save and some thoughts from having played it previously. I played this on the 3DS during a really long car journey, and it was a really nice time waster. I didn't play all that much of it though, so I was happy to go back and re-experience it here. I remember it taking me a very long time to get used to. It was my first introduction to the older generation of games, and so there was definitely a little bit of a learning phase. What's amazing about this one is that it starts off with an intro gameplay segment that really sets the scene for the story and the world. You're put on a sandboat drifting across the plains when a gigantic monster erupts from underneath you and pursues the boat. You are tasked with manning the weapons on the boat in order to take it down. There's also a cool segment where you walk on top of the back of the monster in order to retrieve the Caravanier's hat. After this intro, you arrive at this game's village, which is incredibly vibrant. I really like this one, and the main reason is due to the tiny little details throughout it. Things like the smithy, as well as the palico that's constantly frying stuff in the wok, just adds a really cozy atmosphere to the whole thing. Since you can't move the camera within the village, it means the layout is also really straightforward. It's basically just one singular straight line with everything you need on each side of it. It also just felt more natural to me coming from World. Everything just made a lot more sense here, and doing things like eating before hunts came natural. There was a lot of story and exposition that was dumped on me during this village introduction section, which tends to lose my attention in quite a few games. I did the usual chores of the beginning section of the game, and then finally got the quest to kill the very first monster. Now I was super confused whether this was actually the first monster in the game, as online seems to think that it is, but also you get a quest for a Great Jaggi way before this. The Great Jaggi ones aren't required quests though, whereas this is. And also, since we've already fought a Great Jaggi, I thought it'd be wise to pick the Seltas instead. saw a lot of people saying this was one of the best first monsters in the entire franchise due to its ability to properly teach you the game. Excited to see if the hype was real though, I began making my way towards him. This save already had a charge blade that I was using before, so I just kept with that instead of using the greatsword. I did some side quests as well as some upgrading before this, so I wasn't sure if I was going to be a bit overgeared for this quest. Regardless though, this guy's design is by far the most unique one so far. I don't think I've ever fought a big bug monster like this in World or Rise, so this was another brand new experience to me. I'm glad there are more monsters based off of bugs in Wilds, because although I'm not a big fan of bugs in real life, in a Monster Hunter game, the combination of different insects into one complete design definitely mixes things up from the usual dinosaur inspired ones. Since this is the only flying monster that we're going to kill in this video, I was a bit worried that he was basically never going to come down on the ground for me to hit him. To my surprise though, he actually stayed on the ground for pretty much most of the fight. I was however more focused on learning the charge blade again, as I have only recently tried it for the very first time, as it's going to be my main weapon when I play Wilds. It was a bit different than the one that I tried in World, but I got used to it pretty quickly. Anyway, back on focusing on the actual first monster, he really did not hit me all that much, and when he didn't really hit that hard either. The most challenging part was actually trying to find him again because he left the area and I forgot to paintball him. I wandered the map for quite some time before finally bumping into him again, chasing him down and then dealing the final blow. Now maybe I was a bit over-equipped as this fight did end pretty quickly, but it's also just common knowledge that the series gradually got more accessible and therefore a lot more easier as the franchise went on. And speaking of accessible, the first monster that you face in the final game on my hit list is a walk in the park.
Very well. Then sail safe and strong, and may the Sapphire Star light your way.
After countless herbs and mushrooms collected, and raptor-looking monsters defeated, we finally arrive at our final destination. The 5th generation of Monster Hunter was a gigantic turning point in the franchise's future. The leap in quite literally everything technical blew everyone's mind, but what was so special about this game wasn't what it did for veterans of the franchise, but the sheer amount of new players it enticed. Before I ramble about this game for too long, let's focus on the actual thing that we want to do, and that's kill the very first monster. The game, like Monster Hunter 4, opens with a lot of story and world building. You start off on a boat like any good RPG does, and then you are attacked by a giant lava-filled monster known as Zorah Magdaros. This does a great job at easing the player into basic mechanics like climbing. It all ends pretty quickly though, and you get swept away across to the new world. The handler is extremely thorough guiding you through this portion of the game. It's clear that the idea here is to make newer players have a greater chance of sticking around. This game really shows how gaming has changed over the years. It's a running trend in the past 5 to 10 years that games, especially in the beginning section, tend to take the controller away from you constantly in order to guide you. I've got accustomed to this direction in game design, with the latest titles often letting you switch your brain off and not have to think much at all. After discovering the tiny Jagras creatures, you follow some tracks. This is our first monster, already here in the first 15 minutes of gameplay, although we aren't fighting it just yet as an Anjanath interferes. You're then taken into the village of this game, and the game dumps a lot of story and more tutorials on you, and it even holds your hand for equipping your armor and weapons, as well as getting you to try out some of the tutorials. After grabbing the greatsword, I decided to eat a meal before talking to the handler, one of mine and I'm sure hundreds of others' favourite mechanic of these games. Now after that, the handler gives us our first quest, not collecting mushrooms or herbs, but rather killing 7 Jagras. Quickly mopping up this quest and entering the next one, I was told to kill some Kestodons, and after doing that, we followed the tracks and my objective changed to hunt the Great Jagras. This fight shows how far we have come from the beginning of the video. The Great Jagras, whilst looking extremely goofy, features an extreme amount of realism. And not just from the visuals, but rather the way it acts. There is some sort of magic that the team injected into this game that makes every encounter feel legitimate and real. This monster for me though definitely didn't feel as epic of a fight as the Seltas from Monster Hunter 4 or the Great Jaggi from Monster Hunter 3. I think since the team knew that this was going to be the first monster and therefore had to be super basic to get new players on board, he ends up for me feeling pretty lackluster and quite boring. It does of course hold a special place as it being my very first monster that I've ever hunted in the series. Him going down easily was an understatement, and with the final monster going down in this long video, we have finished the short but sweet tour throughout the whole franchise. I had a blast going through these older games for this video, and I hope that you enjoyed my ramblings on the experience. I wish I explored older Monster Hunter games a lot sooner, to be honest, because there is clearly a lot of great monsters, locations, and so much more that I've missed out on. Maybe if I was put on the series a lot earlier as a kid, I might have found it easier to go back to these older titles. The problem I had was that Capcom delivered me the most tasty meal they could cook up, and so the thought of trying out their less developed meals wasn't exactly enticing. However, you do really have to look past the set dressing of the newer games, as there's so much here to love in these older ones. So we've explored every generation of Monster Hunter, and now it's time to enter a brand new one with Monster Hunter Wilds. It isn't out just yet as of writing this video, but I'm hoping that it's going to be a really good game. And if you're a fan of the series or just fan of retro games in general, then you should join the Discord using the link in the description. It's mainly just a place where we talk about common interests and stuff, so if you want to come have a chat, then feel free to do so. If you enjoyed this type of content and want more, then please leave a like and a comment letting me know. I realised whilst making this one that I'm not really that great at this kind of stuff compared to the other stuff that I make on the channel, but I'm so down to do more and get better at it. Also, a massive thanks to all the YouTube members and Patreon supporters that keep this channel alive. You can do the same for just £1 a month, either using the link in the description to my Patreon or hitting the join button below. Both have the same perks, so just choose whichever platform you prefer the most. If you enjoyed this video, why don't you check out my other videos that are on screen now. See you over there.